I was the Alpha King's fated mate, the lost queen he spent 10 years mourning. But when I finally stood before him, I had no scent, no memory, and a traitor's curse that made me a ghost in my own palace. He looked right through me, snarling at the soulless servant I'd become, never realizing that the scentless girl he just ordered to the silent seat is the only woman who can stop the needle of bone currently aimed at his heart. Anya didn't know what scared her more, the sound of the blood dripping from her knuckles or the fact that she couldn't feel the pain. She stared at the floor of the high citadel's butchery, watching a single red bead slide down a crack in the ancient stone. Around her, the air was thick with the copper tang of raw meat and the heavy, humid scent of wood smoke, yet she smelled nothing. No matter how hard she tried, the world remained a sensory desert, a flat landscape where the vibrant aromas of the pack were lost to her. She was a ghost in a house of predators, a scentless freak whose very existence was a quiet insult to the gods of the moon. Her hand moved on instinct, swiping the rag across the flagstones to erase the evidence of her clumsiness. To make things worse, the head cook was pacing the upper galley, his heavy boots thudding like a heartbeat against the timber. Anya kept her head down because looking up invited a strike, and her body was already a map of bruises. Deep down, she knew the truth. If they realized she wasn't just a lowly Omega, but something far more broken, they would toss her to the winter wolves. She was 22 years old, a girl with no name and a hollow chest where a wolf's soul should be. Without warning, the heavy oak doors at the top of the stairs groaned open, and a hush fell over the steaming kitchen. The usual clatter of knives and shouting died instantly, because the presence that entered was too heavy to ignore. Anya felt the temperature in the room drop, a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air and everything to do with authority. She squeezed the rag in her fist, her chest aching with a sudden sharp pressure. What followed was the sound of silk whispering against stone, a sharp contrast to the rough burlap and wool of the kitchen staff. The matriarch of the North walked with a grace that felt like a threat. She was the mother of the king, a woman whose eyes were said to see through bone and spirit alike. Anya didn't move, her breath caught in her throat as the hem of a midnight blue gown appeared in her peripheral vision. The air thickened around them, and for the first time in years, Anya felt a prickle of heat at the base of her neck. Maybe it was fate, or maybe it was just the cruelty of the stars, but the matriarch stopped exactly in front of Anya's bucket. The silence stretched until the only sound was the bubbling of a massive cauldron of stew. In that moment, the matriarch reached down, her slender ringed fingers tilting Anya's chin upward. Anya's heart skipped, her wide silver gray eyes meeting the piercing gaze of the Queen Mother. The matriarch's nostrils flared, searching for a scent that wasn't there, yet she didn't pull away in disgust. Instead, her grip tightened, and her eyes clouded with a shock that looked dangerously like recognition. "You," the matriarch whispered, her voice a low vibration that made Anya's bones tremble. "You have been hiding in the dark while the world thought you were cinders." Anya's thoughts spun, her mind racing to find a lie, but the words died before they could reach her lips. Before she could move, the matriarch leaned in closer, her breath warm against Anya's ear. "Tonight, girl, you stop scrubbing the floors of the dead and start walking the halls of the living. What's worse than being a ghost is being a ghost on display." Anya stood in the center of the royal guest chambers, her skin still tingling from the scalding water the handmaidens had used to scrub the scullery grime away. They had dressed her in a gown of spun silver, a fabric so light it felt like cobwebs against her skin, and yet it felt heavier than chains. Not only that, but they had draped a veil over her face, turning her into a mystery for the noble wolves gathering in the great hall below. She didn't know what to do with her hands, so she pressed them against the cold stone of the balcony railing. Below her, the kingdom of the north stretched out like a sleeping beast, a vast expanse of dark pines and jagged peaks white with snow. Truth be told, she missed the kitchen. In the dark, she knew where the shadows were, but here, the moonlight felt like an interrogation. As the silence roared, she heard the distant, haunting howl of a wolf, a sound so lonely it made her soul answer with a silent cry. Moments later, the matriarch returned, carrying a small, carved wooden box that smelled of ancient cedar and dried roses. She placed it on the vanity and looked at Anya through the mirror, her expression unreadable. "The king is a man of stone, child," the matriarch said, her voice softer now, almost reaching a point of tenderness. "He has lived in a winter of the heart since the night he lost his mate. He believes the moon has forgotten him." Anya's voice trembled as she finally found the courage to speak. "Why me? I have no scent." "I am nothing to a king." She felt the vulnerability of her words hanging in the air like a plea. Because the matriarch knew the answer, she didn't answer right away, instead opening the box to reveal a pendant of moonstone. "Because he needs to see that even a ghost can return," the matriarch replied, her eyes locked on Anya's reflection. She fastened the cold stone around Anya's neck, and as the mark tingled on her hip, Anya felt a sudden, sharp jolt of electricity. It was a memory, not a full thought, but a feeling of running through the tall grass, a massive black wolf at her side. Between them, something cracked in the fortress of her mind, a door opening just an inch. The tension broke when the great horn sounded from the valley, announcing the start of the feast. Anya felt the pressure of the moment, the weight of 1,000 expectations she didn't understand. She was being led to a throne she didn't want, to sit beside a man who would surely hate her for her broken nature. Even so, she walked toward the door, her heart pounding a rhythm of run, stay, run, stay. Beneath the moonlight, she looked like a goddess, but inside, she was still the girl with the bloody knuckles and the empty soul. The great hall was a sea of fur and firelight. Hundreds of wolves sat at long trestle tables, their voices a low, rhythmic growl of conversation and laughter. Anya walked behind the matriarch, her head bowed behind the veil, her world narrowed to the path of stones beneath her feet. With every step she took, the air grew colder, more oppressive, as they approached the high dais. The king sat there, a silhouette of raw power and jagged edges, his presence a vacuum that sucked the joy from the room. As if pulled by a string, Anya was led to the chair at the king's right hand, the seat that had remained empty for a decade. A gasp rippled through the front tables, a wave of shock that followed their movement. Anya felt the weight of his stare before she even looked up, a heavy, predatory focus that made her skin itch. Malachi, the Alpha King, was a mountain of a man, his obsidian hair falling over shoulders that looked wide enough to carry the sky. The moment their eyes locked through the thin fabric of her veil, time stood still. Malachi didn't move, his jaw tightening until the muscle leapt in his cheek. He didn't smell the sweet floral scent of a noble bride or the musk of a warrior. He smelled the absence of her. To make things worse, his own scent, a wild, intoxicating mix of pine needles and a coming storm, rushed over her, making her breath catch. "Mother," Malachi growled, the sound so deep it made the wine in the goblets vibrate. "What is this? Why have you brought a scentless stray to the table of my ancestors?" His voice was a blade, cold and sharp, cutting through Anya's fragile resolve. She felt the sting of his rejection, a familiar pain that burned hotter than the torches on the walls. The matriarch didn't flinch, her voice calm and steady. "She is the guest of the moon, Malachi. Sit, eat. Look at her not with your nose, but with your spirit." Anya felt the king's fury, a heat that radiated from him in waves. Yet she didn't turn away, because something in the way he gripped the arms of his throne told her he was as terrified as she was. He leaned in close, his face inches from her veiled ear, his voice a lethal whisper. "I don't know what game you are playing, Ghost, but don't think for a second you can replace her. You are a shadow in a room full of light." Anya's chest ached, the moonstone at her throat pulsing with a sudden, frantic heat. Without thinking, she turned her head toward him, her eyes meeting his through the veil. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted, and the silent seat felt less like a prison and more like a cliff's edge. As the dinner progressed, Anya felt the eyes of the High Council boring into her like poisoned arrows. In fact, the High Seer, Varkas, hadn't looked away from her once, his pale, sickly green eyes narrowed in suspicion. Anya tried to eat, but the food tasted like ash. Her mind focused on the massive man sitting inches away from her. Malachi ignored her, ripping into his meat with a primal intensity, yet she noticed how he stayed perfectly still whenever her sleeve brushed his arm. While the forest held its breath outside, the tension in the hall reached a breaking point. Varka stood, his bones creaking as he leveled a long, skeletal finger at Anya. "King Malachi, this is an abomination!" he cried, his voice echoing off the rafters. "To seat a scentless girl at the right hand is to invite the great hunger back into our lands. She is a void! She is a curse!" Anya felt the room turn on her, the low growls of the pack rising like a tide. She wanted to scream, to tell them she didn't choose this, but her voice was a trapped bird in her throat. Malachi slammed his fist onto the table, the wood cracking under his strength, and the room fell silent. "She is my guest!" he roared, his eyes glowing a fierce, molten gold. "And until I say otherwise, any insult to her is an insult to the crown." She felt it, etched in fire, the sudden, undeniable bond of protection he was casting over her. Still, she saw the way Varkas smiled, a slow, ugly thing that made her blood run cold. The seer knew something she didn't, a secret hidden in the dark corners of her lost years. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, Anya felt a sudden, sharp vision. Varkas, holding a needle of bone, leaning over her as she lay on a cold stone altar. She gasped, her hand flying to her throat as the memory burned through her. Malachi noticed, his hand hovering over hers, but never quite touching. "What is it?" he demanded, his voice less like a king and more like a man who was starting to drown. Anya couldn't answer, because the truth was unraveling too fast for her to catch. Before either could speak, the doors of the great hall burst open, and a scout drenched in rain and blood stumbled inside. "The Shadow Fangs!" the man wheezed, falling to his knees. "They've crossed the border! They're hunting the ghost!" Anya's world tilted, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. They weren't just here to see her seated. They were here to see her die. The air thickened with the scent of blood and fear as the hall erupted into chaos. Malachi was on his feet in a second, his body expanding, his skin rippling as his wolf pushed to the surface. Anya stood frozen, the veil finally slipping from her face to reveal her pale, haunting features to the entire council. What followed was a moment of pure, crystalline silence as the pack saw her face, the face of the queen who had died 10 years ago. "Ilara?" a voice whispered from the crowd, and then another, a chorus of disbelief. But Malachi didn't say her name. He only stared at her, his eyes full of a soul-crushing agony. He didn't know whether to embrace her or kill her for the lie. Anya felt her instincts surge, her wolf pressing forward against the cage of her scentless body, a wild, desperate energy. Without another word, Malachi grabbed her by the waist, throwing her over his shoulder like a prize of war. He didn't wait for the council's permission, leaping from the dais and sprinting toward the rear exits. Anya's thoughts spun as she felt the power of his muscles, the raw, animal strength that defined his reign. Shadows danced between them as they raced through the stone corridors, the sounds of fighting echoing from the hall they had just left. As the sky darkened outside, Malachi burst through the postern gate and into the freezing rain of the mountain. He set her down beneath the shelter of an ancient oak, his hands gripping her shoulders with a bruising force. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice breaking, his forehead resting against hers. "Tell me the truth, or I swear by the moon, I will leave you to the fangs." Anya looked into his eyes, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her soul answering the call of his proximity. "I don't know," she sobbed, the honesty of it cutting through the night. "I remember the dark. I remember the pain. And I remember you. I remember the way you looked at me before the world went black." The tension broke as Malachi let out a jagged, broken sound, pulling her into a fierce, crushing embrace. As her wolf stirred deep within her, Anya felt the first true spark of life ignite in her chest. She didn't have a scent, and she didn't have her memories, but she had him, and she let it happen, closing her eyes as the king's heart beat against hers, a promise of war and love in the coming storm. Under the weight of his stare, she realized the silent seat was just the beginning. The real fight was for the soul she had forgotten she owned. Anya's world tilted as the cold mountain rain lashed against her face, each drop feeling like a needle of ice. She stood shivering under the ancient oak, the rough bark scraping against her back while Malachi loomed over her like a thundercloud. His hands were still heavy on her shoulders, his fingers digging into the silver silk of her gown, as if he were trying to anchor himself to a reality that was slipping away. Deep down, she knew the truth. The man before her wasn't just a king anymore. He was a broken soul looking for a miracle she wasn't sure she could provide. Because of the chaos in the hall, the sounds of snarling and clashing teeth still echoed through the stone walls behind them. What followed was a moment of agonizing choice for Malachi, his eyes darting between the safety of the castle and the dark, treacherous tree line of the moon peak. Anya felt his conflict vibrating through his touch, a jagged, raw energy that made her wolf stir in its deep, scentless slumber. She didn't know what scared her more, the monsters hunting her from the shadows, or the desperate, hungry hope burning in the king's golden eyes. "We can't stay here," Anya whispered, her voice trembling as it was swallowed by the roar of the wind. Without thinking, she reached up and placed her small, cold hand over his, trying to pull him back from the edge of his fury. In that moment, Malachi's expression shifted from rage to a haunting, raw vulnerability that made her chest ache. He didn't speak, but rather swept her back into his arms, his body moving with a predatory grace that defied the slippery mud beneath his boots. As the silence roared between them, they plunged into the thicket, the forest closing around them like a dark, suffocating shroud. Next, the climb became a grueling test of endurance, the path narrowing into jagged rocks and tangled roots that seemed to grab at Anya's silver hem. Still, Malachi didn't slow down, his breath coming in steady, rhythmic puffs of steam in the freezing air. He was a force of nature, a wall of muscle and heat that shielded her from the worst of the storm. By the time they reached a hidden cave tucked behind a frozen waterfall, Anya's legs felt like lead. Malachi set her down on the dry stone floor, his obsidian hair plastered to his forehead, his chest heaving with the effort of the ascent. She watched him from the shadows of the cave, noting the way his hands stayed curled into fists, his knuckles white and bloodless. To make things worse, the lack of scent between them felt like a physical wall, a barrier that kept him from truly believing she was the woman he had lost. "Why didn't you stay dead?" Malachi growled, though the words lacked their previous bite, sounding more like a plea for mercy. He paced the small space, his boots clicking against the shale, his shadow dancing against the jagged walls. Anya didn't move, her back pressed against the cold stone, her mind a whirlwind of fragmented images and silver needles. In fact, she felt more like a thief now than she ever had in the kitchens, wearing a face that belonged to a ghost and a heart that belonged to him. Maybe it was fate, or maybe it was just the adrenaline, but Anya found herself standing up to meet his gaze. "I didn't choose to forget you, Malachi," she said, her voice growing stronger with every heartbeat. "I was a ghost because someone made me one. Someone stole the scent from my skin and the memories from my head." As the truth unraveled, she saw the way he flinched, his predatory stance softening for the briefest of seconds. Between them, something cracked, a bridge of shared pain that spanned the decade of their separation. Malachi stopped his pacing, his eyes locked on her with an intensity that made her skin hum with a phantom heat. Soon after, he stepped into her space, his scent, pine, rain, and something ancient, filling her senses until she felt lightheaded. Without another word, he reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that shattered her remaining defenses. That night, the cave became a sanctuary and a prison all at once. Malachi managed to strike a small fire, the orange flames casting long, flickering shadows that danced across the ceiling. Anya sat huddled by the warmth, the moonstone at her throat pulsing with a dull, rhythmic light that seemed to mirror the king's heartbeat. Not only that, but the silence between them was no longer empty. It was heavy with the things they were both too afraid to say out loud. "Varkas did this," Malachi said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in Anya's bones. He was sitting across from her, his gaze fixed on the fire, his jaw set in a hard line of grim realization. "He was the one who claimed the shadow fangs took you. He was the one who brought me your blood-stained cloak." Because he had trusted the seer, the betrayal tasted like poison in his mouth, a bitter reminder of the years he had spent mourning a lie. Anya felt a surge of cold dread at the mention of the name, the image of the bone needle flashing behind her eyes again. "He wanted you to be alone," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the wood. "He wanted the king to have no heir. He wanted the king to have no heart." She looked at her hands, the skin pale and scentless, realizing that her very existence was a weapon aimed at the man she was falling for all over again. With his scent in the air, Malachi moved closer, his heat radiating off him like a furnace. He didn't ask for permission as he pulled her into his lap, his large hands anchoring her against his chest. Anya's breath caught, her head resting in the crook of his neck, her soul answering the call of his proximity. In the quiet that followed, she felt the first true stirrings of her wolf. A faint, distant howl that echoed her own longing. Come morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world wrapped in a crystalline, deceptive peace. Anya woke to the sound of Malachi shifting, the rhythmic crackle of bone and muscle as he took his human form again after a night of guarding the entrance. She felt a sharp, sudden pang of desire as she watched the play of muscles across his scarred back, the raw power of him making her blood sing. Yet she knew that the peace wouldn't last. The shadow fangs were still out there, and Varkas wouldn't stop until the ghost was truly dead. "We need to move," Malachi said, turning to look at her, his eyes molten and determined. "There is an old temple further up the peak. It holds the moon's well. If anything can restore what was stolen from you, it is there." He reached out a hand, his fingers tangling with hers, a silent promise that he wouldn't let her go a second time. Anya felt the bond pulsing between them, a golden thread that defied the lack of scent and the missing years. Before she could move, a low, guttural growl echoed from the woods outside the cave, making the hair on her neck stand up. The air thickened with a foul, rotting smell, the scent of the shadow fangs. They had found them. Anya's instincts surged, her hand flying to the moonstone at her throat as the first of the dark wolves emerged from the mist. What followed was a blur of silver and shadow as Malachi stepped in front of her, his body rippling with the coming change. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. Malachi roared, the sound echoing off the mountainside like a landslide, and the fight for survival began in earnest. Anya watched, her pulse racing as the king tore into the first attacker with a primal fury that left her breathless. She didn't have a wolf, and she didn't have her memories, but she had a king who would kill the world to keep her safe. And she let it happen, her heart screaming a silent war cry as she prepared to fight for the life she was only just beginning to remember. The metallic tang of fresh blood sliced through the morning air, a sharp contrast to the pristine snow that now looked like a shattered mirror of white and red. Anya huddled against the cave's mouth, her hands clenched so tight her nails drew crescents in her palms, while the sound of snapping bone filled the canyon. Malachi was a blur of obsidian fur and raw violence, his massive wolf form tearing through the shadow fangs as if they were made of paper. Yet she felt a hollow ache in her chest, a scream of a wolf that had no voice, trapped behind the invisible walls Varkas had built in her mind. Because of the sheer brutality of the attack, the remaining shadow fangs retreated into the mist, their yelps echoing like a promise of more blood to come. What followed was a moment of heavy, vibrating silence as Malachi shifted back, his skin steaming in the cold air, his eyes still glowing with a lethal, molten light. Anya didn't move as he approached, her gaze fixed on the crimson streaks on his chest that looked like war paint against his pale skin. She didn't know what scared her more, the monsters in the woods or the primal possessive power radiating from the man she used to call her husband. "The temple is close," Malachi rasped, his voice sounding like grinding stones as he pulled on his discarded tunic. Without thinking, he reached out and wiped a stray drop of blood from Anya's cheek, his touch surprisingly gentle for a man who had just committed slaughter. In that moment, the space between them burned with an unspoken heat, a magnetic pull that threatened to drag Anya back into a life she couldn't fully recall. Still, she followed him out of the cave, her feet sinking into the soft, treacherous snow as they climbed higher toward the peak where the clouds seemed to touch the earth. As the silence roared between them, they reached the crumbling gates of the Moonswell Temple, a structure made of white marble that seemed to glow with its own internal light. Next, they entered the central chamber, where a pool of liquid silver sat beneath a hole in the roof, reflecting the pale disk of the midday moon. To make things worse, the air inside felt heavy with ancient magic, a thickness that made Anya's skin prickle and her moonstone pendant vibrate against her skin. In fact, she felt as though the very stones were whispering her name, calling the ghost back to the fountain of her soul. "Go to the water," Malachi commanded, his voice echoing off the high, arched ceiling like a prayer. He stood at the entrance, his back to her, his posture that of a guardian who would die before letting another soul cross the threshold. Anya walked toward the silver pool, her reflection in the liquid surface looking like a stranger she had met in a dream. Truth be told, she felt like a thief standing on the edge of a treasure she hadn't earned, her breath coming in ragged gasps that clouded the air. Maybe it was fate, or maybe it was just the moonstone's pull. But Anya reached out and touched the surface of the silver water. Between one breath and the next, the world shattered. A wave of ice-cold energy surged up her arm, hitting her heart like a physical blow and forcing a jagged gasp from her lungs. Not only that, but the memories began to hit her like a landslide. the smell of lavender in her mother's hair, the weight of a crown on her brow, and the feeling of Malachi's wolf fur against her skin during their first run. She felt it, etched in fire, the moment the scent thief potion finally began to crack under the weight of the moon's power. Without warning, a scream ripped from Anya's throat, a sound that wasn't human and wasn't quite wolf, vibrating through the temple until the marble walls groaned. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, she saw Varkas again, his rotting green eyes narrowing as he whispered the curse that had turned her into a ghost. Because the magic was being unmade, the pain was excruciating. 1,000 needles of light stitching her soul back into her body. Malachi was at her side in a single heartbeat, his arms wrapping around her as she collapsed toward the silver pool. "Anya, stay with me!" he roared, his voice a tether that kept her from drifting into the white void of the transformation. She gripped his forearms, her knuckles white, her body rippling with a change that felt like her bones were being remade from stardust. In the quiet that followed the scream, a scent began to rise from her skin, a faint, ethereal aroma of wild lilies and fresh snow that made Malachi freeze. The moment their eyes locked, the air thickened with a desire so potent it made the silver water ripple. "Elara," he whispered, her true name falling from his lips like a sacred oath, his eyes filling with a wonder that broke her heart. Still, the victory was incomplete. The scent was there, but the wolf was still a shadow, pacing at the edges of her mind. Rather than pulling away, she pressed her forehead against his, her voice a trembling thread of hope. I remember everything, Malachi." Soon after, the ground beneath the temple began to shake, a low, ominous rumble that signaled the arrival of something darker than the shadow fangs. Anya felt her instincts surge, her newly returned scent acting like a beacon for the darkness that had been hunting her for a decade. What followed was a shadow falling across the silver pool as Varkas himself stepped into the chamber, his skeletal form draped in robes that looked like funeral shrouds. He wasn't alone. A dozen wolves with eyes like glowing coals flanked him, their presence turning the sacred temple into a tomb. "The ghost has a name again," Varkas sneered, his voice a dry rasp that made Anya's blood run cold. "But a name is just a word to carve on a headstone." Malachi stepped in front of her, his body already shifting, his obsidian fur bristling with a rage that shook the very foundations of the temple. In that moment, the stakes became higher than a throne or a crown. They were fighting for the right to exist in the light. Before the words left her lips, Anya felt a sudden, sharp clarity, a realization that she didn't need a wolf to be a queen. She stood tall, her silver gown torn and stained, the moonstone at her throat glowing with a blinding brilliance that rivaled the silver pool. Because of the moon's well, she could feel the power of the mountain itself flowing through her veins, a cold, lunar energy that answered to her will. She didn't know what scared her more, the seer's magic or the raw, untapped power waking up inside her. "You stole 10 years of my life," Anya said, her voice no longer trembling, but ringing with the authority of the high seat. As the silence roared, she raised her hand, and the silver water of the pool rose like a shimmering blade. Not only that, but Malachi let out a roar that signaled the charge. his massive form a blur of teeth and claws as he met the shadow fangs head on. The temple became a whirlwind of fur, blood, and silver light. A dance of death played out beneath the eye of the midday moon. A beat later, Anya unleashed the water, the silver liquid hitting the dark wolves like a hammer of pure light. Yet Varkas didn't flinch, his hands weaving a counterspell of sickly green energy that hissed against the lunar magic. The space between them burned with the friction of their powers, a battle of wills that threatened to tear the temple apart. With his scent in the air, Malachi fought his way toward her, his every move a testament to the protector bond that had never truly broken. Under the weight of his stare, Anya felt her wolf finally break its chains, not with a roar, but with a surge of light that blinded everyone in the room. As the sky darkened with a sudden localized eclipse, she realized the memory thief had failed. She wasn't just Alara, the lost queen. She was something new, a daughter of the moon who had walked through the dark and found her own fire. And she let it happen, her heart screaming a war cry as she prepared to finish the man who had tried to make her a ghost. The temple air vibrated with a sound like grinding glass as Anya's lunar magic collided with Varkas's rotting green shield. She felt the raw power of the moon's well rushing through her veins, a cold fire that made her fingertips glow with a terrifying silver light. Because the seer had spent a decade feeding on her stolen energy, the connection between them was a jagged two-way street of pain and power. Still, she didn't pull away, her eyes locked on his withered face as she forced the liquid silver water to wrap around his ankles like molten chains. What followed was a roar that seemed to split the very foundation of the mountain as Malachi lunged for the seer's throat. Yet Varkas was faster than his frail body suggested, disappearing into a cloud of sickly green smoke and reappearing on the high altar. To make things worse, the shadow fangs he had brought were not dying. They were shifting into distorted bone-white monsters that ignored the silver burns on their skin. Anya felt a sudden, sharp pressure in her skull, a whisper of the old curse trying to reassert its dominance over her mind. "You are nothing but a memory, Alara!" Varkas shrieked, his voice echoing in the span of a breath across the chamber. Without warning, he unleashed a wave of dark energy that sent Malachi crashing into the marble pillars, the sound of breaking stone sickeningly loud. Anya felt the world tilt, her heart skipping a beat as she watched the king fall, his obsidian fur matted with dust and blood. Even so, she didn't let her focus waver, because she knew that if she fell now, the north would fall with her. In the quiet that followed the impact, Anya realized that the midpoint shift had arrived. She could no longer just survive. She had to conquer. Not only that, but she felt the moonstone at her throat burn with a heat that finally matched the liquid silver in the pool. She didn't know what scared her more: the possibility of losing Malachi, or the sheer magnitude of the power she was about to unleash. As the silence roared, she stopped fighting the water and started fighting the air itself, calling down the moonlight through the hole in the temple roof. Between one breath and the next, a pillar of pure, white light slammed into the altar, throwing Varkas backward and dissolving the dark wolves into ash. Anya stood at the center of the storm, her silver gown whipping around her legs, her eyes no longer gray, but a brilliant, glowing white. Maybe it was fate, or maybe it was just the blood of the ancient queens finally waking up. But she felt her wolf press forward. No longer a shadow, but a solid, silver-furred goddess. Truth be told, she felt like she was being remade from the inside out, her bones remembering a strength she had never truly lost. Malachi rose from the rubble, his golden eyes wide with a mixture of terror and worship as he watched her. "Ilara," he whispered, his name hanging in the air like a prayer. Soon after, he shifted back into his human form, his chest heaving, his hand reaching out to her as if she were a vision that might vanish. But she didn't vanish. She walked toward him, the silver light trailing from her fingers like silk, the air around them smelling of wild lilies and the coming dawn. That night, they didn't return to the citadel. Instead, they retreated to a high ridge overlooking the valley, the stars watching them like 1,000 silent eyes. Anya sat by a small fire Malachi had built, her body still humming with the aftershocks of the lunar magic. Despite that, the silence between them was different now. It was the silence of two souls who had finally found the missing pieces of a broken map. She felt his stare under the weight of the darkness, a hungry, intense focus that made her skin tingle. "I thought I was a thief," Anya whispered, her voice a soft thread in the wind. "I thought I was stealing a life that didn't belong to me." Because she had spent so long as a ghost, the reality of her own power felt like a heavy crown she wasn't sure she could wear. Malachi moved closer, the space between them burning with a heat that had nothing to do with the fire. He took her hand, his thumb tracing the new, glowing mark of the moon on her palm. "You didn't steal anything," he growled, his voice a low, possessive rumble. "Varkas took your past, but he couldn't take your soul." In fact, the king looked at her with a raw intensity that made her breath catch, his fingers tangling in her hair as he pulled her closer. Anya felt the bond pulsing between them, a golden cord that was thicker and stronger than it had ever been before the assassination. She leaned into him, her heart aching with the sheer weight of the love she finally remembered. Come morning, the reality of their situation crashed down on them like an avalanche. While the forest held its breath, they watched a trail of torches winding up the mountain. The High Council and the remaining royal guards were coming for them. To make things worse, they weren't carrying the banners of celebration. They were carrying the black flags of mourning and judgment. Anya felt a surge of cold dread, realizing that Varkas had likely returned to the citadel to spread more lies about the witch who had bewitched the king. "They think you've killed me or cursed me," Malachi said, his eyes narrowing as he watched the approaching line. "Varkas will tell them the silver light was a demon's mark, not a queen's gift. Because the pack was superstitious and fearful, the truth would be a harder sell than the lie." Anya stood tall, her instincts surging as she realized that the silent seat was no longer enough. She would have to fight for the throne itself. As her wolf stirred, she looked at Malachi and saw the same determination mirrored in his face. What followed was a silent agreement, a pact made in the span of a breath between a king and his reclaimed queen. They wouldn't run, and they wouldn't hide. They would meet the pack as equals, as the sun and the moon of the north. With his scent in the air, Anya felt a growl rise in her throat, a sound of a wolf that was finally, irrevocably home. The air thickened as the first of the council members reached the ridge, their wolves snarling at the perimeter. Varkas was among them, his face a mask of false grief, his rotting green eyes hidden behind a hood. "The king is lost," he cried, his voice carrying down the line like a plague. "The ghost has consumed his soul." Anya felt the pressure of the moment, the stakes rising until she felt like she might shatter under the weight of it. Before the words left her lips, she stepped forward into the morning light, her tattered silver gown shimmering like a fallen star. As if the world narrowed, every eye turned to her, and for a heartbeat, the silence was absolute. She didn't speak. She simply let her scent, the lilies in the snow, explode outward in a wave of authority that brought the lead wolves to their knees. Her world tilted as she realized the power of being seen, truly seen, for the first time in 10 years. Malachi stepped up behind her, his hand resting firmly on the small of her back. A declaration of his loyalty that no one could ignore. "The queen has returned," he roared, the sound echoing through the valley and silencing the whispers of the seer. Anya felt the mark on her hip tingle, a final confirmation of her identity that even the council couldn't deny. And she let it happen, her soul answering the call of the pack as she prepared to take the seat that was no longer silent, but screaming for justice. Anya felt the air turn into static as the High Council's wolves circled the ridge, their hackles raised and their low, rhythmic growling vibrating in the soles of her feet. She stood her ground, her fingers curled into the palms of her hands, the new silver mark on her skin pulsing with a cold, protective fire. Deep down, she knew the truth. The citadel was no longer a home, but a trap waiting to snap shut, and Varkas was the one holding the spring. She didn't know what scared her more, the prospect of a civil war, or the way Malachi's wolf was pacing just beneath his skin, ready to paint the snow red. Because the council was paralyzed by the sudden explosion of her scent, the moment hung in a fragile balance, a crystalline second where a single breath could shatter the peace. What followed was a wave of confusion that rippled through the ranks of the royal guard, their eyes darting between the ghost they had mocked and the king who stood at her back. Anya felt her heartbeat thundering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Yet, she didn't let her gaze waver from Varkas, whose rotting green aura was clashing against the pure morning light. "You call her a queen?" Varkas shrieked, his voice cracking like dry parchment. "She is a phantom raised by the shadow fangs to lead us to our ruin." Without warning, he raised his staff, and a bolt of sickly energy hissed through the air toward Anya's heart. Before the words left her lips, Malachi moved, his body a blur of speed as he knocked the bolt aside with his bare hand, the skin blackening instantly from the touch of the curse. Anya felt her world tilt, a scream of fury rising in her throat as she saw him flinch. In the span of a breath, the ridge became a battlefield of ideologies and instincts. Not only that, but the matriarch stepped forward from the crowd, her voice a clarion call that cut through the chaos. "Enough!" she roared, her presence alone forcing the nearest wolves to lower their heads. "The moon does not lie, and neither does the blood of our ancestors." Because the matriarch had the respect of the elders, the circle of wolves widened, but the tension remained thick enough to choke the life out of the mourning. Still, Anya knew that words alone wouldn't win the day. She needed to prove that her soul was reclaimed. She stepped toward Varkas, her silver gown snapping in the wind, her voice sounding like the chime of cold bells. "You stole my life to make the king weak," she said, her eyes glowing with a lunar light that made the seer recoil. "But you only succeeded in making me remember what it means to be a wolf of the north." In fact, she felt her internal flaw, the belief that she was a broken mistake, dissolving into a diamond-hard resolve. Maybe it was fate, or maybe it was just the bond pulsing between them. But Malachi stepped up to her side, his blackened hand still smoking as he locked fingers with hers. The space between them burned with a heat that defied the mountain chill, a burning, intense fire of mutual protection. Soon after, the council began to murmur, their suspicion turning into a hesitant, fearful reverence as they witnessed the raw chemistry of the true mates. To make things worse for Varkas, the shadow fangs he had hidden in the trees began to howl in frustration, their cover blown by the rising sun. That night, they marched toward the citadel gates, a procession of torches that looked like a burning serpent winding down the mountain. Anya walked at the head of the line with Malachi, her head held high, though her insides felt like they were being twisted by iron hands. Despite that, she didn't look back. She focused on the high stone walls of her former prison, realizing that she was the only one who could unlock the truth. She felt the weight of the silent seat waiting for her, but this time she wouldn't be a guest. She would be the judge. "Once we enter those gates, there is no turning back," Malachi whispered, his voice a low rumble that only she could hear. He looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch, his golden eyes searching hers for any sign of hesitation. Because he had lost her once, his possessiveness was a tangible thing, a wall of protective energy that wrapped around her like a second skin. Anya squeezed his hand, her soul answering his silent plea with a promise of absolute loyalty. What's worse than the threat of death is the threat of being forgotten again. But Anya felt her wolf pressing forward, eager for the confrontation. In the quiet that followed their approach to the gates, she realized that Varkas had one final card to play. As the heavy iron-reinforced doors groaned open, the air inside the citadel courtyard smelled of ozone and ancient forbidden herbs. Without thinking, Anya raised her hand, the silver light from her palm illuminating the shadows where the seer's true acolytes lay in wait. Before either could speak, the trap was sprung. A net of dark, shimmering energy dropped from the ramparts, designed to suppress the shifting ability of anyone caught beneath it. Anya felt her pulse race as the world turned gray, the vibrant colors of her reclaimed memories fading as the magic tried to strip her bare again. Yet she didn't fall. Instead, she reached deep into the memory thief void and found the spark of the moon's well still burning in her chest. As the silence roared, she unleashed a shockwave of silver light that shattered the dark net like brittle glass. Not only that, but Malachi shifted midair, his obsidian wolf form a mountain of fury as he lunged at the guards on the wall. The fight was no longer a skirmish. It was a desperate, high-energy struggle for the heart of the kingdom. Anya watched, her chest aching with the effort of holding the lunar shield, while the protector bond between them acted as a beacon in the darkness. With his scent in the air, she felt her own transformation beginning, not the forced, painful version from the temple, but a natural, rhythmic unfolding of her spirit. Her bones remembered him, and her soul answered the call of the pack. Between one breath and the next, she let the change take her, her silver gown shredding as her body lengthened into the form of a great white wolf. And she let it happen, her first roar as a queen echoing through the citadel, a sound that signaled the end of the ghost and the birth of a legend. Anya felt her heart plummet as the shimmering dark net touched her skin, the magic feeling like 1,000 leeches draining the warmth from her blood. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted from vibrant silver to a dull, suffocating gray. Her knees hit the cobblestones of the courtyard, the impact jarring through her spine as the connection to her wolf was severed with the force of a physical blow. Deep down, she knew the truth. Varkas hadn't just come to fight. He had come to erase her soul for a second time, and this time, there was no moon's well to catch her. Because the energy was designed to specifically target the royal lineage, Malachi let out a jagged, broken roar of pain as he was forced back into his human form midair. He crashed into the stone beside her, his obsidian hair matted with blood, his golden eyes dimming into a hollow, human brown. What followed was a moment of pure, agonizing silence as the royal guards they had inspired just minutes ago retreated in fear. Anya reached out for his hand, but her fingers felt like lead, her body too heavy to carry the weight of her own despair. "Look at your savior now!" Varkas laughed, his voice echoing off the high stone walls like the tolling of a funeral bell. Without warning, he stepped from the shadows of the ramparts, holding a jagged blade made of obsidian that pulsed with the same sickly green light as his eyes. Before the words left her lips, he plunged the blade into the ground, and the earth itself began to moan. Anya felt her world tilt as a rift opened beneath her feet, the cold, stagnant air of the abyss rushing up to meet her. In the quiet that followed the earth's tremor, the matriarch tried to reach them, but a wall of shadow fangs blocked her path with snapping jaws. Not only that, but Varkas unleashed a thick magical fog that smelled of rot and old graves, blinding the allies who remained. Anya felt a sudden, sharp sting of betrayal as she saw several council members step toward Varkas, their fear of the unknown driving them into the arms of the traitor. Because the pack's loyalty was built on strength, her current weakness was a death sentence in their eyes. Still, the worst blow was yet to come. Malachi looked at her, his face a mask of such utter defeat that it hurt more than the magical net. "I can't feel you, Alara," he whispered, his voice a ghost of the roar that had once shaken mountains. "The bond, it's gone." Anya felt her chest ache, a physical pressure that made it hard to breathe, as the golden thread that had anchored her to life snapped into pieces. She didn't know what scared her more, the blade in Varkas's hand, or the emptiness where her mate used to be. Maybe it was fate's final cruelty, or maybe it was just the seer's mastery of the dark arts, but Anya found herself being dragged toward the rift by invisible chains. Between one breath and the next, she saw Varkas raise his hand to deliver the final blow to the grounded king. Without thinking, she threw her body over Malachi's, acting as a human shield for a man who could no longer protect her. As the silence roared, she realized that she was back where she started, a nameless, scentless girl waiting for the end in the dark. That night, the citadel felt like a tomb. Varkas didn't kill them. Instead, he threw them into the Iron Barrens, a set of cells deep beneath the mountain, where the stone was laced with silver to prevent shifting. Anya sat in the corner of the damp cell, the moonstone at her throat now dark and cold as a river pebble. Not only that, but Malachi sat across from her, his head in his hands, refusing to look at her because he couldn't bear the sight of the woman he had failed. To make things worse, the sound of Varkas being crowned as the regent of the north echoed through the vents above them. "I should have left you in the kitchen," Malachi rasped, the words cutting through Anya like a jagged blade. He didn't mean it in hate, but in a grief so deep it had turned into poison. "You were safe there. You were a ghost, but you were alive." Anya felt a surge of tears, her vulnerability exposed in the flickering light of a single dying torch. Because she loved him, the idea of him carrying this guilt was more painful than the silver-lined walls. What followed was the lowest point of her soul's journey. Anya closed her eyes and tried to find the lunar sovereign she had glimpsed at the temple, but there was only a vast, echoing hollow. In the stillness that followed, she felt like the memory thief had finally won, stealing not just her past, but her future and her hope. As the silence roared, she leaned her head against the cold iron bars, watching the last of the torchlight flicker and die, leaving them in a darkness that felt permanent. By the time the midnight hour struck, the air in the cell had become thin and freezing. Anya felt her pulse racing, not with excitement, but with the frantic beat of a trapped animal. Without warning, the cell door creaked, and a figure draped in a servant's cloak slipped inside, carrying a small bowl of watery broth. It was the head cook from the scullery, the man who had once kicked her, and for a moment, Anya felt a flash of her old, ordinary world terror. Yet the man didn't strike her. Instead, he knelt and whispered, "The kitchens remember you, ghost. We remember the girl who worked until her hands bled." He slipped a small, rusted iron key into her palm, his eyes darting toward the shadows where the guards paced. Because he was an unwanted wolf, he knew how to move through the citadel like a shadow, unnoticed and underestimated. Anya felt a tiny, flickering spark of warmth in her chest. Not magic, but the simple, human strength of a found family. Before she could move, the cook disappeared back into the darkness, leaving her with the key and a choice. Anya looked at Malachi, who was still lost in his own despair, his spirit as broken as his body. She didn't have her scent. She didn't have her magic, and she didn't have her king's strength. Still, she gripped the rusted key until it bit into her skin, her internal flaw of worthlessness finally meeting its match in her core strength of resilience. In the span of a breath, she realized that a queen wasn't defined by her throne, but by what she did when the lights went out. Anya didn't know what scared her more, the freezing weight of the iron shackles or the hollow silence in Malachi's eyes. She sat on the damp floor of the Iron Barrens, her fingers trembling as they closed around the rusted key the cook had left behind. Deep down, She knew the truth. If she waited for the magic to return on its own, they would both be dead by sunrise. She looked at Malachi, who was curled into a ball of silent agony, his spirit seemingly crushed by the loss of the bond. Because he had defined himself by his strength as an alpha, the silver-laced walls were a slow-acting poison to his mind. What followed was a moment of quiet, desperate resolve that tasted like iron and salt. Anya crawled across the stone, the chain rattling against the floor like a mocking laugh. Without thinking, she jammed the rusted key into the lock of Malachi's shackles, her breath catching as the metal resisted. Next, a sharp click echoed through the cell, and the heavy iron fell away, leaving his wrists red and raw. Anya felt a sudden, sharp surge of hope, a tiny spark in the dark that refused to be extinguished. "Malachi, look at me," Anya whispered, her voice a low vibration that seemed to cut through his stupor. She grabbed his face with both hands, forcing his dull brown eyes to meet her silver ones. In that moment, she didn't see a king, and she didn't see a wolf. She saw the boy who had loved her before the world went black. Still, he didn't move, his breath hitching as if he were afraid to believe she was real. Before the words left her lips, she pressed her forehead against his, her heart pounding a rhythm of, "Wake up, wake up, wake up." By the time the moon reached its zenith, they were moving through the labyrinthine tunnels beneath the citadel. Anya led the way, her senses heightened by the adrenaline, her instinctive empathy acting as a compass in the absolute dark. Not only that, but she felt a new kind of power stirring, not the loud, roaring magic of the moon's well, but a quiet, steady hum of the earth itself. Because she had spent years in these shadows, the darkness felt like an old friend rather than a predator. What's worse than the guards above was the fear that they were too late. As the silence roared, they reached the entrance to the scullery, where the air smelled of stale grease and wood smoke. Soon after, a dozen pairs of eyes reflected the dim light of a single candle. The unwanted wolves, the kitchen staff, the stable hands, and the scarred omegas stood waiting for them in a circle of silent defiance. Anya felt her chest ache with a sudden fierce pride as she realized she wasn't leading a pack. She was leading a revolution. "The seer thinks we are ghosts," Anya said, her voice carrying a weight that made the stone walls tremble. "He thinks because we have no titles, we have no power." She looked at the head cook, then at the young stable boy, her gaze lingering on each face. In fact, she realized that their low status was their greatest weapon, because Varkas never bothered to look at the people who cleaned his floors. Maybe it was fate, or maybe it was just the North finally waking up. But the room filled with the sound of low, determined growls. That night, the plan took shape in the flickering shadows of the butchery. Anya stood at the center of the map, her finger tracing the hidden vents and secret passages that led to the high throne room. Despite that, the danger was absolute. If they were caught, there would be no trial, only the obsidian blade. She felt Malachi's presence behind her, his heat a constant grounding force, even without the bond. Because he saw the fire in her eyes, his own golden light was beginning to flicker back to life, his shoulders squaring for the first time since the courtyard. "I will take the main doors," Malachi growled, his voice regaining its jagged authority. I will draw the shadow fangs out. And the pack will follow the king they thought was dead. Anya shook her head, her hand resting on the moonstone at her throat, which was starting to glow with a faint, defiant silver light. Rather than letting him go alone, she looked at the unwanted wolves and saw their teeth bared in the dark. Between them, something shifted. The silent seat was becoming a war drum. What followed was the final push toward the surface. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, Anya felt the lunar magic returning, but it was different now. It was fueled by her love for these people, not just her bloodline. She led her secret army through the vents, their movements as quiet as falling snow. To make things worse for Varkas, he was currently in the middle of his coronation feast, his arrogance blinding him to the shadows closing in. Anya felt her instincts surge, her wolf finally, irrevocably pacing at the front of her mind. In the quiet that followed their arrival at the throne room's hidden entrance, the tension broke like a fever. Anya watched through the grate as Varkas sat on Malachi's throne, the obsidian blade resting across his knees. Not only that, but the High Council sat in fearful silence, their heads bowed to a traitor. Because the North was built on honor, the sight of the seer on the throne was a sacrilege that made Anya's blood boil. She looked at Malachi and gave a single, sharp nod. Before either could speak, the stone wall exploded outward as Malachi charged, his human roar joining with the sudden, unified howl of the scullery wolves. Anya stepped into the light, her tattered silver gown looking like armor in the torchlight, her eyes glowing with the full, unbridled power of a sovereign. With his scent in the air, even through the magic dampening stone, she felt the bond snap back into place with the force of a lightning strike. The air thickened as the two halves of a broken soul finally merged into one. Under the weight of his stare, Anya didn't wait for Varkas to react. She unleashed a wave of silver light that transformed the Iron Baron's chains in her heart into a weapon of pure lunar energy. As her wolf stirred and finally broke through the surface, she realized the final push wasn't about reclaiming a throne. It was about reclaiming the right to be seen. And she let it happen, her silver-furred form lunging toward the seer, with a roar that signaled the end of the long, silent night. Anya didn't know what scared her more, the sound of the obsidian blade clattering against the stone, or the absolute deafening silence that followed her roar. She stood over the crumpled form of Varkas, her silver-furred chest heaving, the lunar light from her coat illuminating the shocked faces of the High Council. Deep down, she knew the truth. The battle of teeth and claws was over, but the battle for the heart of the North was only just beginning. She looked at Malachi, who was shifting back into his human form, his eyes no longer hollow, but burning with a pride so fierce it made her soul ache with joy. Because the traitor had been exposed in the middle of his own feast, the room smelled of ozone, copper, and the sweet, sudden scent of justice. What followed was a wave of the unwanted wolves flooding into the hall, their kitchen rags and stable aprons held like banners of victory. Anya felt her heartbeat slowing from a frantic drum to a steady, regal pulse as she shifted back, her silver gown miraculously whole once more, glowing with the remnants of the moon's power. Yet, she didn't look at the throne. She looked at the people who had helped her reclaim it. The seer is gone, Anya said, her voice carrying a weight that forced every wolf in the room to their knees. In fact, it wasn't a command, but a statement of a new reality, a world where a ghost could become a queen. She felt Malachi's hand slide into hers, his fingers lacing with hers, with a finality that signaled the end of their 10-year winter. Before the words left her lips, the matriarch stepped forward, placing a hand on Anya's shoulder and another on Malachi's. In the span of a breath, the coronation began not with gold, but with the sharing of blood and scent. Not only that, but Anya insisted that the head cook and the scullery staff sit at the high dais, breaking the ancient laws of caste to create a new, unified pack. She felt the vulnerability of the moment, the raw emotional payoff of being seen for who she was, not just what she represented. Because they had survived the dark together, the bond between the people and their rulers was no longer a matter of fear, but of true, hard-won loyalty. Still, the most precious moment happened later, away from the prying eyes of the council. Malachi led her to the balcony overlooking the moonlit valley, the same place where she had once felt like a prisoner. Soon after, he pulled her into his arms, his scent, pine, rain, and ancient snow, wrapping around her like a protective shield. I spent 10 years looking for you in the stars, Ilara, he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion that made her eyes sting. I never thought to look in the shadows of my own home. Anya leaned her head against his chest, listening to the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart. Maybe it was fate, she replied, her voice a soft caress in the night air. I had to become a ghost to learn how to be a queen. Because of the memory thief, they had both learned that love wasn't about the scent of a mate or the title they held, but the way their souls answered one another in the dark. In the stillness that followed, she felt the mark on her hip glow one last time, a final seal on her destiny. That night, the silent seat was silent no more. The great hall echoed with the laughter of the unwanted and the noble alike, a found family theme that promised a future of acceptance and peace. Anya sat beside Malachi, their fingers intertwined beneath the table, their eyes meeting in a sizzling private promise of the passion to come. Despite that, she knew there would be challenges ahead, but with the moon as her witness and the king at her side, she felt invincible. She was no longer the feast's ghost. She was the feast's fire. Come morning, the first rays of the sun hit the citadel, turning the white stone into a beacon of hope for the entire kingdom. Anya woke in Malachi's arms, the warmth of his body a constant reminder that the nightmare was truly over. To make things worse for any future traitors, the North was now a pack that looked out for its smallest members, a lesson learned from the girl who had cleaned the floors. Anya felt her instincts surge with a peaceful, settled joy, her wolf finally at rest within her. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted into a fairy tale equilibrium. Anya walked to the balcony and looked out over her people, her heart full of a love she had once thought was stolen forever. The wind carried his name to her, and she felt him step up behind her, his arms circling her waist as they watched the new dawn together. As the truth unraveled into a lifetime of happiness, she realized that every tear and every scar had led her to this moment. And she let it happen, closing her eyes as the Alpha King kissed her. Their happily ever after, written in the stars and etched in fire. A year later, the high citadel was a place of music and light. Anya stood in the nursery, her hand resting on the small of her back as she watched a massive obsidian wolf gently nuzzling a tiny, silver-furred pup. The memory thief was now a legend told to children to teach them that even the smallest voice can shake a mountain. Because they had chosen to build a kingdom of love, the North was stronger than it had ever been in the history of the wolves. A beat later, Malachi shifted back, picking up the pup and pressing a kiss to Anya's forehead. "She has your eyes," he murmured, his voice full of a tender, quiet wonder. Anya smiled, her soul answering the call of her family, her heart finally, irrevocably home. The silent seat was now a place of stories, and as the moon rose over the peak, she knew their story was just beginning. It was a deeply satisfying fantasy fairy tale ending, proving that no matter how long the night, the sun and the moon would always return.